Zack Snyder vows to make a King Arthur movie that's fully faithful to the original legend. Mr. Snyder, I got 2 words for ya. Title sequence. Adapting someone else's original fiction creation is one thing and always going to raise questions when you make your own deviances from the original. But what happens when you're trying to adapt something whose story already evolved and changed over time before the modern days? This is, of course, the subject of legends, and as others have pointed out, there may not be a greater legend than the Arthurian one. The legend of King Arthur was originally born out of the myths of a supposed actual king that ruled Britain around the turn of the 6th century. Much of the myths, themes, and events we associate with Arthur Pendragon began with the writings of the British cleric Geoffrey of Monmouth, who completed his work in 1138. The lore has since been adapted many times, but before the age of film and TV, perhaps the most well-known telling of the King Arthur legend post-Geoffrey was Sir Thomas Malory's compilation Le Morte d'Arthur, first published by William Caxton in 1845, with a more accurate original manuscript of Malory's discovered by Walter Fraser Oakeshott of Winchester College in 1934. Le Morte d'Arthur seems to now be the standard bearer for the written legend of King Arthur, and yet many elements we now associate with the legend actually differ from what is in this collection of books. For example, in Malory's work, Arthur didn't actually build the Round Table, he inherited it from Guinevere's father. The Holy Grail is barely mentioned, and as we'll soon see, the influence of Morgan Le Fay on the events is really non-existent in the original tale. There have been other written works such as T.H. White's The Once and Future King, but as far as video goes, there are perhaps 2 film versions most well known. Disney's animated film The Sword and the Stone, which took a lot of creative liberties in order to make the story more family-friendly, and John Boorman's epic Excalibur, which did everything it could to tell a supposedly more accurate tale, possibly at its own expense. When Nash Bozard reviewed Excalibur, he largely criticized the movie for sacrificing a cohesive story and good character motivation in favor of trying to be as faithful to the Arthurian lore point for point as possible. However, in 1998, a new version came out that may not have only fleshed out its own characters better than Boorman's counterpart, it may actually be even more faithful to the original lore. That would be the TV miniseries Merlin. Premiering on NBC on April 26, 1998, the miniseries was part of Hallmark's recurring series of television specials in the late 1990s, adapting fables, legends, and classic stories, primarily with the production help of Robert Halmy Sr., which also included a certain other movie we've already reviewed this year. Is this film going to take us on another acid trip like Hallmark's interpretation of Alice in Wonderland did? Let's get into the Merlin miniseries and find out.
Once upon a time. No, that's not the way to start. You'll think this is a fairy tale, and it isn't.
And next you're just gonna think I'm some kind of crazy old guy or something. Not that I'm really spoiling anything, but this is Merlin, who will be the narrator for this entire film. He begins his tale talking about the days basically when paganism was gradually being replaced by Christianity, and how the lands would be ruled by a cruel despot up until he would be killed and overthrown by someone who turns out to be just as bad, if not worse. At least we know that'll change in 2,000 years, right? It's here we meet the main antagonist of the movie, Queen Mab, arguing with her sister, the Lady of the Lake, both of whom are played by Miranda Richardson. Talk about having an argument with yourself. They're discussing how people are no longer believing in the old ways of magic, and if people stop believing, magical beings like themselves will cease to exist. Fun fact, this wasn't the first case I ever saw of suggesting that magic only exists when people believe in it. Seriously, look up and read Peter Spear's attempts to novelize the King's Quest games. The Lady of the Lake is willing to accept this change, but Mab won't go down without a fight, and declares she will create the greatest wizard ever, who will then lead the people back to the old ways. She goes back to her fortress of solitude, where her little imp servant Frick awaits. And yes, he's played by Martin Short, who may have the unluckiest last name in history. I mean, remember when this guy had to get cast as a 10-year-old kid when he was 43? Mab creates the soul of this great wizard from a crystal, and then impregnates some unsuspecting woman with it. I think this is still how people in Alabama think babies are made.
I name this child Merlin.
Now, while you're making gestures, save the mother. She's dying.
No, she's not. She's dead.
What's your excuse? Why didn't you save her?
She'd served her purpose.
So, I know I said at the beginning that this movie is actually more faithful to old lore than many others, but we are gonna have to talk very early about where it most deviates. Mab is most definitely the largest creative liberty it takes with the Arthurian legend. Some of you may be aware that a version of her was featured in the British Merlin TV series made a decade later, but this was the first time Queen Mab was ever indoctrinated into Arthurian lore. And she's not just shoehorned in here. The movie flat out states that pretty much every single major event in the legend happens because of her. She is the puppet master of Arthurian history in this story. So we fast forward a few years and see Merlin as a horny teen. Not kidding there, because the first thing we see from this character is him immediately getting the hots for this character. This is Nimue, played by Isabella Rossellini, and while at first she doesn't take too kindly to our hero being a masher, he gets his second chance when she falls into the bog, and he has to rescue her by making a big stick grow bigger and bigger. So much innuendo! I may as well get this character out of the way now because this is the second biggest creative liberty the movie takes. Though here it's more justified given the variances in these older tales. In some versions, Nimue was simply the actual name of the Lady of the Lake. I assume that was what the Excalibur movie went with, as by my recollection, no mention of any other such character was made. However, other versions say that not only was Nimue an actual person, it was she and not Morgan Le Fay who became Merlin's protege, only to betray and imprison him, usurping his post as Arthur's advisor in the process. This miniseries goes in a completely new direction from both of those, as here Nimue is Merlin's love interest, and essentially becomes the driving force behind his vendetta against Mab. Oh yes, they're going in that direction. Don't open the refrigerator, Kyle! Merlin returns home to his caregiver, Ambrosia, to tell her how excited he is that he finally met a girl, but when Ambrosia hears how he rescued her, she realizes it's time he has to be taken away from her. Sure enough, Merlin is eventually directed to Mab's Isle and brought before her by Frick.
This is Merlin, who comes to save us. He will bring the people back to the old ways.
If there is one major gripe I have about the miniseries, it's that the first of the two parts really does drag, particularly the first half of it here. It's mostly about Merlin spending his youth in Mab's world being taught the various forms of magic under Frick's tutelage, while showing off a bunch of special effects that, like in the last Robert Halmy movie we saw, might have looked cutting edge for the time, but really have not aged well. I'd estimate most of the show's budget was used up in the first 20 minutes. Frick ultimately tells Mab that Merlin doesn't really like magic and just wants to go home. This actually comes off pretty deeper than you may think at first. Like any child prodigy who grows to dislike whatever trade he's supposedly good at because he's pressured by everyone around him to succeed at it. Mab's solution to all of this is to kill off Merlin's mother figure, which drives Merlin to run away and swear off magic forever. In case you haven't figured it out, Mab is not the best at people skills. Fast forward once more, and it is here the movie delves into ancient Welsh lore of how Merlin first came to be discovered. King Vortigern, played by the late Rutger Hauer, is looking to build a fortress in the mountains that can protect from the advancing forces of Lord Uther. But the fortress has a little problem. Staying erect! Once again, it is Mab that causes the next events to fall into motion, telling Vortigern's soothsayer that the land is cursed, and they must sacrifice one who does not have a father in order to lift it. They eventually find Merlin, now fully grown and played by Sam Neill, and bring him before the king, where he points out there is no curse, but that a running stream within the mountain makes the land too unstable to sustain any type of building.
Was that so difficult to figure out? I mean, you're my science guy, right?
This, combined with Merlin predicting Uther will eventually defeat Vortigern, drives him to force Merlin to be his advisor, making him a prisoner in his castle where, guess what, Nimue is as well, since Vortigern imprisoned her in order to blackmail her father into staying loyal to him. So naturally, once they bond more and more romantically, Mab shows up again and convinces Vortigern to sacrifice Nimue to the great dragon. This is, of course, to force Merlin into using his powers, but while he does save Nimue's life, he can't stop the dragon from burning her, and thus carries her off to Avalon to be treated before going to the Lady of the Lake to obtain, you guessed it, Excalibur! And then he betrays Vortigern to Uther. I should point out that Vortigern was one of the last kings still loyal to Mab in the old ways, and her actions caused her pet project to directly join forces with those out to destroy Vortigern. Good job, witch! Merlin aids Uther and his forces in finally defeating Vortigern, and once the battle is won, he gives Uther Excalibur, saying it belongs to whoever is worthy of being king. So, how long does it take Uther to convince Merlin he made a mistake? About 2 minutes once Uther lays his eyes on Lord Cornwall's wife. Though for what it's worth, it's shown here that Uther's hot-bloodedness may have been manipulated by someone else. You seeing the pattern now? So when Uther begs Merlin to aid him in getting Lady Igraine, Merlin's response is to take Excalibur from him and, you guessed it, plant it in a stone and ask this rock spirit to watch over it until someone truly worthy arrives.
And I will be holding it forever.
And yes, the rock spirit is voiced by James Earl Jones. After that, Merlin returns to Avalon to be with Nimue, but she cannot bear to go back out into the outside world, still bearing the permanent scars of the dragon. I wonder if there's some irony there, what with Merlin calling his power the dragon in that other movie. So you pretty much know what happens next. Merlin returns to Uther and agrees to help him bed Igraine, demanding that he get possession of the child they'll bear in the hopes he'll become the great king he hopes to make. And of course, there is one teeny tiny little extra detail differing this movie from Excalibur. Thanks to broadcast television standards, we don't get to see the rape of Igraine in full pornographic detail. Thank frack! There is one added detail here, though, as when Frick goes on Mab's orders to try and curse the soon-to-be-born king, he ends up befriending Igraine's older child, Morgan Le Fay. Oh yes, this is definitely a plot point. So part 1 ends with the eventual King Arthur being born, while Merlin and Mab challenge each other like pro wrestlers cutting a promo on one another.
You're easily fooled, Merlin. Uther fooled you when he killed Cornwall. Now his child is damned.
The boy is mine.
He'll be his father's son. Because of him, the chaos of blood will go on and on. And out of it, the people will come back to me.
I'll see you fade into nothing!
Gee, someone send this to Seth Rollins to show him how it's done! Part 2 of the miniseries is where we dive headfirst into the story of King Arthur himself, though still from the perspective of the wizard Merlin. And this is where the miniseries really begins to show off its strongest suits, especially in comparing to its film predecessor of nearly 2 decades. And it starts with the motivations of our main character. For better or worse, Robert Halmy and director Steve Barron's version of Merlin is much more fleshed out here than John Boorman's. In Excalibur, Merlin's quest to unite the land under one king was simply out of a desire to see the wars between the different rulers come to an end, and what he personally gets out of it is not very clear, unless he's just the ultimate altruist or something. Here, he clearly hopes that a united kingdom will accelerate the spread of the new ways, because that is exactly what Mab does not want. He's seen firsthand how cruel and unjust the old ways can be, and is hoping a new Christian king can help bring an end to them and her. Whether or not he can succeed in that is another matter. Part 2 begins with old Merlin explaining how he gave Arthur to be raised by Sir Ector and stayed on as his tutor. Sadly, we do not get a snarky pet owl named Archimedes. Until the day Uther kills himself. That's a new interpretation. And thus Merlin flat tells Arthur it's time to make him king. Well, no beating around the bush here. After we get Mab sending after Merlin a pack of griffins that look like they belong in Jumanji, Merlin brings Arthur to the Sword and the Stone. Interesting note here, the Merlin miniseries and the Excalibur movie both have one thing in common that deviates from Mallory's work, in that they show the sword driven into an actual stone, while in the book it was in an anvil on top of a stone. Yeah, that's something that Disney, of all people, was more accurate on. The rock spirit allows Arthur to claim Excalibur, and Merlin brings him to the bickering lords to show them who the rightful king is. Many of them, upon seeing Excalibur, do bow and recognize Arthur, except for Lord Ergonese, who is willing to start another war, but Arthur attempts to stop it by letting Ergonese take Excalibur. Bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off.
Forgive me, Arthur. I can feel it.
So yeah, this does stay more or less true to the legend, as in the old stories, it is indeed Ergonese that knights Arthur, thus overcoming the final obstacle toward the people accepting Arthur as king. It's still an almost impossible task to show just why Ergonese would do this after previously refusing to serve him, but for what it's worth, this scene does a bit better job showing how holding Excalibur makes Ergonese see the light and understand that he is not meant to be king and Arthur is, thus better showing just what the sword Excalibur is meant to represent. It's not that he who has the sword has the right to be king, it's he who is worthy of being king is worthy of having the sword. You're all making a bunch of Thor jokes right now, aren't you? It's at this point that Mab claims to have given up on Merlin, and being the vindictive bitch that she is, now just wants to destroy everything he's trying to build. So she has Frick go back to his old friend Morgan Le Fay, who he turns into Helena Bonham Carter, and then proceeds to whore her out to the king! Oh yes, we're at that stage already. Though once again, thanks to the standards of broadcast television, we are spared having to watch the actual incest act in person. Now, whatever you may think of the creative liberties the movie has taken so far, this is actually one of the biggest examples where the film is more true to the original legends than other adaptations that preceded it. In Le Morte d'Arthur, the corruption of Arthur and subsequent birth of his incestuous bastard son, I really just had to say that, does in fact occur in the first book of Mallory's series, even before Arthur meets and marries Guinevere. Though for what it's worth, in the book it was not Morgan Le Fay that Arthur did the deed with, but another sister of his named Morgause, who has more or less been stricken from most modern-day adaptations in favor of making Morgana a greater villain. That being said, I now really don't know why John Boorman chose in his film to have the event take place after Lancelot and Guinevere's affair in exile, unless it was to somehow show the only way Arthur could ever be corrupted like that was because he was weakened from the pain of discovering his wife's betrayal. But the way it's done here not only adheres more to the original tale, it just makes more sense from a story perspective. Arthur is simply young and naive, and above all has no idea who Morgan is until Merlin tells him after the deed is done. Now Arthur has a sin of the past he must try to conceal and still find a way to atone for, by building Camelot and striving for his and Merlin's dream of ushering in the greatest era of peace in the land. And at the same time, suggesting that even Morgan was all being manipulated by Mab the whole time makes it perhaps a bit more sensical. Mab plants in Morgan's head not only the rage for what Uther did to her mother, but uses her own power through Frick to grant her the beauty she thinks she didn't have, thus placing her further in debt to the old ones. Let's see how she'll ultimately be repaid in the end. Still, this is another example of what I've alluded to earlier and what you no doubt have seen so far, how perhaps the movie's greatest strength above its contemporaries may also be its biggest flaw. As Nash and perhaps others have brought up, the main issue with Excalibur was that the creators cared more about making sure the events of the legend occur point for point than they did creating character motivations for why they do what they do. Merlin does try to explain why the events of the legend happen, but they do so through the one character they forced into the story themselves. Every single thing that happens in the King Arthur legend, according to this movie, happens because of Queen Mab. She creates Merlin's birth, she forces him to learn magic, she sets him up to be in Vortigern's employ, she takes Nimue away from him, thus driving him to betray Vortigern for Uther. Her sister gives Merlin the sword in order to aid his vendetta against her. She manipulates Uther's lust for a grain, leading to Arthur's birth. And she manipulates Morgan into corrupting Arthur and conceiving the child she believes will destroy Merlin's dream of bringing about peace through the new ways. Now, you may ask, how could a being as powerful as this create the world's most powerful wizard and dare think the way to winning him over to her side is to let his mother die, cause his girlfriend to be disfigured and exiled, and then interfere in all his attempts to create a united, peaceful kingdom, including orchestrating freaking incest? But I present to you there is a very logical reason for why she would do all of this. Mab is knucking farts! As Arthur plans the quest for the Holy Grail, and Merlin knows Mab will ultimately use Morgan's child to destroy Arthur, the Lady of the Lake takes him to Joyeska to find one pure of heart, where he finds Lancelot with his family, including son Galahad. Yes, this is important. And convinces Lancelot to come to Camelot and look over the throne in Arthur's stead. Again, you pretty much know much of what happens next. Lancelot and Guinevere can't keep it in their pants, and once Arthur returns home without the Grail, Morgan's son Mordred arrives to confront him. However, it turns out Morgan wasn't ready to deal with empty nest syndrome, so Mab offs her! Which now puts her at odds with Frick, since he kind of had a thing for Morgana. Mab really knows how to burn every bridge around her, doesn't she? And why is that suddenly hitting too close to home for me? Mordred reveals Guinevere's treachery, forcing Arthur to condemn her to be burned at the stake like a heretic, only for Lancelot to rescue her and ride off with her in exile. Though in this version they add the little detail of Arthur convincing Merlin to create a rain shower that stops the fire, giving Lancelot his chance. Mordred uses this to publicly condemn Arthur of violating his own laws of equality, ultimately forcing Arthur to fight Mordred and his forces for the country. However, it turns out Mab has one more trick up her sleeve, tricking Merlin into leaving Arthur to be with Nimue so he won't be at Arthur's side in battle. Thus we see how Nimue did keep Merlin from protecting Arthur, but not really. As we see this final battle, there is still time to point out one more thing this miniseries not only does better from a story standpoint, but also from a historical one. The armor. Nash talked a lot about how clunky the battle scenes in Excalibur were from everyone fighting in full plate mail armor. Thing is, that type of armor actually was only ceremonial back then and not meant for battle. For that very reason. It's similar to why soldiers today don't wear blue uniform jackets while fighting in the jungles or the Middle East. What we see in this mini-series is at least a better attempt to replicate what soldiers and knights did wear for fighting. So by the time Merlin returns, he is of course too late, and the dying Arthur asks Merlin to throw Excalibur back into the lake, rather than Sir Percival, as most of the stories say. And unlike Percival, Merlin has no qualms at all doing so, taking the time to accuse the lady of lying to him about Lancelot being their savior, only for the lady to point out that she never said it was Lancelot. Merlin was supposed to bring back Galahad. Bitch, then why did he not tell him to go and find the one named Galahad? You actually thought Merlin would know the one who could protect Camelot was a 10-year-old boy? Even Arthur was older than that when he drew the sword. The subject of Galahad may actually be where the movie does get really messy with the original lore. In Le Morte Arthur and other stories, Galahad is indeed the son of Lancelot, as well as the knight who actually finds the Holy Grail. Excalibur pretty much ignores Galahad and makes Percival the one who finds the Grail, so in that case, Merlin is again more faithful to the source, Except that in the original lore, Galahad was born after Lancelot fell in love with Guinevere, and his conception was, well, just like Arthur's. As Galahad's grandfather had a witch cast a spell on his daughter to trick Lancelot into thinking she was Guinevere, as he'd supposedly been told by God that his daughter would bear the child who would eventually find the Grail. I'm willing to bet the movie truncates and changes Galahad's story in order to keep the film's runtime right at the 3-hour length it needed to be. That and avoiding the little controversy of someone using magic to commit rape in order to try and bring about holy peace. For the second time in the story! With Arthur dead and the sword thrown away, Merlin goes to confront Mab in Camelot for the magical ultimate showdown of ultimate destiny. I have mixed feelings on this climax. On the one hand, it does seem like the producers are just showing off by exhausting the remaining budget on this fight that ends in a stalemate, and that's kinda pointless. However, then comes Merlin finally realizing what it will take to finish Mab off forever.
Just going to forget you.
Merlin? What are you doing?
You can't fight us or frighten us. You're just not important enough anymore. We forget you, Queen Mab. Go join your sister in the lake and be forgotten.
This, more than anything, is why this movie struck such a chord with me. Beneath all else, Mab represents every bully and tyrant in history that needs the power from intimidation to be relevant. Once she loses that intimidating hold on those around her, and those people just ignore her, she becomes powerless. It's the ultimate example of how no matter how much you try to force your will onto other people, it is ultimately them who will make their own decisions. And when those people make the consensus decision to move forward without you, there's nothing you can do to stop them. When bullies and tyrants can no longer have control over you, they have nothing and are nothing. So Merlin's story concludes with Galahad arriving in Camelot with the Grail to restore peace to the land, and we cut to what would be this movie's present day, where most of those who listen just take it as an old man's wild tale, except for one person.
It's not exactly the way I remember it, Master Merlin.
Vic, is it you?
Some time after Mab disappeared, her spells began to lose their power, and Nimue was set free.
Where is she, Vic?
So Rupert knows.
Sure enough, Merlin finds Nimue at what I assume is the old thatched hut he was raised in as a boy, and with Mab no longer around to prevent him from doing so, Merlin uses the last of his powers to restore both Nimue and his own youth so they can reclaim all the years Mab had taken away from them. Yeah, it seems like a cop-out in order to get as happy of an ending as possible, but hey, it's magic! They don't have to explain it! And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the Merlin TV miniseries. It actually comes off better than I even remember it. There are some things here that haven't aged very well, particularly with the effects. However, outside of forcing in their own antagonist and a few other deviations, this is actually one of the most accurate screen adaptations of the Arthurian legend you're going to find. Director Steve Barron and writers Edward Kamara, David Stevens, and Peter Barnes clearly did a lot of research into the whole legends of both Arthur and Merlin, and did the absolute best they could to mold the differing versions of the legends into a cohesive story. And even they hint within the story itself that what our main title narrator told might not be exactly how it happened, basically saying that anyone's interpretation can still be valid. It may not be as well known as John Boorman's epic or Disney's animated feature, or even the TV series of the same name the Brits would create, but it's still worth checking out if you're able to find it anywhere. Adaptations of classic stories will never be complete retellings, and they really shouldn't be. What they should do, good or bad, is encourage you to hunt down the original stories and check them out for yourself. And maybe they can even inspire you to create your own stories one day. But don't you worry, my rowdy friends. Adaptation year on TV trash continues on, including one example of what happens when you try to get too contemporary with an adaptation. See you next time.